It took me decades to appreciate it, and yet now, every day, I use budgeting, budget projections, probability theory, game theory. But I think our society teaches us to bifurcate creativity from practicality and artistry from math and money. I've always been invested in live cultural experiences, especially after a pandemic that isolated people for so long. The shared experience of witnessing creative, edgy, inventive, engaging, but also unpredictable work in a live context is immensely valuable for education, for community cohesion, for inspiration. The same performance that an artist can do confidently on a stage with the lights blaring in their face, performed one-on-one, can be terrifying because you can see the impact of every single word as it lands on your audience of one or two or three. This is among the reasons that I actually think that close-up sleight of hand magic tricks are among the most difficult and terrifying art forms. We believe that what we are sharing is essential and life-affirming and life-changing to our audience. We will find a way to put the message across, and we will find a way to do it with confidence.
Today we are joined by Daniel Gallant, a cultural leader, writer, strategist, and storyteller whose career has left a lasting mark on New York's art scene. From his decade plus as executive director of the Nuyorican Poets Cafe to leading the House of Speakeasy and now serving as director of external affairs at the Vineyard Theatre, Daniel has been at the intersection of performance, community, and advocacy. In this episode of the Inference Show, we'll explore Daniel's journey, the lessons he's carried through each role, and his vision for the future of the arts. Daniel, welcome to the Inference Show.
Thank you so much, Manish. I'm honored to be here and grateful to have the opportunity to speak with you and exchange some thoughts and stories and talk about the role of creativity in contemporary life.
Now, Daniel, you've worn so many hats, the hat of a writer, director, teacher, fundraiser, executive. Which one is your favorite?
It would be hard to pick among them. I think all of these roles commingle and share responsibilities and strengths, and also sometimes liabilities. I always think it's easier to be a leader, a director, or a manager if one has also been a practitioner of that same discipline or craft that one is leading in. And I think it's even more advisable and more beneficial to everyone involved if a leader is an active practitioner at that art. So if someone running a writing focused organization is a writer themselves, if someone running a sports related organization happens to be an athlete, even in a recreational way, I think it's much easier to have perspective, resonance, and empathy for those who are impacted by one's decisions if one currently is or recently was a practitioner. But of all of those roles, I think being a writer is the most freeing. Being a performer or a public speaker is the one that allows for the most direct impact. And being a leader of any sort, I see that in many ways as being equivalent to teaching or almost serving as a therapist, helping to establish sustainable processes that will help a community grow and sustain itself. And so for me, all of those roles are contiguous whenever possible.
Awesome. Daniel, growing up, what drew you first into the arts?
Well, I was fortunate enough to grow up in a household and in a community where artistic practice, as well as sports, athletics, and academia were valued highly. And I grew up in a household with two parents who, in different but compatible ways, were aligned with the arts. My father, at the time, was an amateur actor. He appeared in a lot of local theater productions, and he continues to this day, even in retirement, to sing in a chorus and to use his voice artistically. So I gained an appreciation for music and the performing arts from him. My mother, throughout her life, has been a writer and a teacher of writing, and so I absorbed literary appreciation from her. And then I was fortunate enough to be in a community where there were opportunities to act, to sing, to play the piano at a young age. But I also, at the same time, was able to immerse myself in sports. And I bring that up because I think there really is a tremendous overlap between the lessons that we learn, the discipline and the teamwork that come from playing and competing on a sports field or in a sports arena. Uh, I think those are compatible traits, characteristics, and skills to artistic practices. And a lot of the most effective and impactful performing and literary artists that I know of um, use techniques that would not be out of place and, in fact, can be of great value on a sports field.
Daniel, NPR has called you a genius at raising money for artists. That's a direct quote from NPR. Do you feel that the early days of you being a kid, but being around people of influence or their family, helped you not being odd? I think you've said that already, but did it help you build connections or understand how they think? And then maybe you didn't have the kind of shyness that other people might have in approaching them. How did it help?
Well, no, it's a great question. And it's interesting. I think a lot of people experience a boomerang effect when they grow up, when they enter the working world and the professional sphere. My boomerang situation was that as a child, I was remarkably shy. I spoke with a stutter. Um, Even though I liked getting up on stage, off stage, I had hesitance about speaking up in groups. Um, and I also, as a child, was not very interested in math, not interested in economics, not interested in money. Um, and yet, because I grew up in proximity to all of these influences, when as a college student and then a young professional and a graduate student, and then as an arts leader, I began to see all of the ways that money, funding, political discourse, public speaking could advance the artistic and political causes that I embraced. Suddenly, all of these influences that had been in my peripheral vision since I was almost old enough to walk began to play a part. My father, in addition to being a very talented vocalist and an amateur performer when I was growing up, um, is also a retired mathematician and professor of mathematics. And a lot of the appreciation for numbers that he instilled in me when I was young, it took me decades to appreciate it. And yet now, every day, I use budgeting, budget projections, probability theory, game theory. All of those disciplines are incredibly relevant to cultural policy. Um, and all of those disciplines and skills are of great use to artists and arts leaders. But I think our society teaches us to bifurcate creativity from practicality and artistry from math and money. And so, in a rambling way, to get back to your question, which I think is a fantastic one, I was fortunate enough to grow up in circumstances where I could see these spheres in conversation with each other. In my parents' own practices, I could see mathematics, financial planning, creativity, um, and writing and performance in conversation. And at school and mixing with my friends, I could see how it could be possible for someone to be a quarterback and also the child of a politician, or someone could be an artist and also related to a political family. So some of these distinctions, these distinct categories that we are taught, separate political life from artistic life, or sports from religion. I was fortunate enough, I guess, to grow up in an area where I could see a lot more connective tissue between disparate functions, disciplines, and creative and practical practices.
Daniel, that is very interesting. Now, you've seen so many successful people, whether in the arts, doing it live right in front of you. And for most normal people, their heart will fall out of their mouth. How do they navigate it? What's the secret? How do they do it?
In part, it is a course practice. Um, Almost anything, any physical activity that we repeat over time, no matter how bizarre, complicated, or terrifying it is at first, it sinks into our muscle memory over time, and we are able to replicate it in some means or other without having to involve conscious thought in the process, which means that conscious thought can wander. The mind can wander to other things. And sometimes what the mind wanders to is a new source of inspiration for that same performance. Um, there are, of course, also those times when someone has been playing the same role on Broadway or on TV for so long that it becomes sort of autopilot, and then some of the inventive, inspiring energy is sapped. But in many cases, the learning of the mechanics of a role allows the artist to find ways to infuse new life into elements of that role that may be slightly different than the previous performance the previous day. But there's also so practice is part of it. Familiarity with the relationship between performer and audience. Because yes, getting up on stage for the first time is one of the most terrifying experiences that anyone can have. And yet, I know a lot of performers who, sort of like I was describing about my own childhood, um, there are a lot of performers who, as adults, are incredibly comfortable on stage, in the spotlight, in an arena, performing before thousands of people, or in a small black box theater performing before dozens of people, or doing stand-up comedy in a club. And yet, sometimes when these artists step off the stage and are interacting in a small group or one-on-one, they can be very, very soft-spoken, sometimes shy, sometimes recalcitrant, because it's such an incredibly different energy that is required to tell a story when you don't have to look any of the spectators directly in the eyes. Stage lights can both be an enemy to the performer if they're not used to them, but they can be a huge ally, a huge friend to the performer. Because once you're on stage with the lights coming down on your face, you're aware of the energy and the presence and the concentration or lack of concentration of your audience. You can hear their breath, you can hear their applause or gasps or whatever reactions, but you can't really identify them as individuals. And that can be a great benefit. It makes anonymous the interaction that you are undertaking and trying to lead. Whereas one-on-one, the same monologue, the same routine, the same performance that an artist can do confidently on a stage with the lights blaring in their face, performed one-on-one can be terrifying because you can see the impact of every single word as it lands on your audience of one or two or three. This is among the reasons that I actually think that close-up sleight of hand magic tricks are among the most difficult and terrifying art forms because you have an audience that is already skeptical. They know you're doing magic, so they're watching every move you make. They're analyzing it up close. Most art forms you can practice at a remove, at a distance from your audience. And sometimes that remove is the printed page. If you're a published author, sometimes it's on a screen and sometimes it's on a stage or through a canvas. But there are a very few art forms in which you must directly confront and be directly confronted and examined by your audience. At the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, the distance between a performer and the audience has always been very, very slight. The stage is never more than a foot off the ground. And often the audience packs the entire space. Sometimes there are people seated on the floor. And so this is another arena in which a performer, even if they have the lights in their face, has to be very confident in their words, very confident in their message. And that's another answer to your question in a roundabout way. You asked, how is it possible for a performer to defy, I think you alluded to stage fright or the paranoia that might naturally come from being in front of a huge audience. It's not just knowing your routine or your words because you practice them, although that's a huge part of it. And it's not just the anonymity that comes from being in front of a crowd rather than in front of a small number of people, although that's part of it. Another big part is truly believing in the work that you are sharing. And if you are passionate about it, if you are convinced of the validity of the work, even if you're playing a character who is reprehensible, and this is where sort of method acting and exploring the psychology behind a character or a role becomes hugely important. But if you can believe that the words and the craft that you are sharing are essential to the experience of the audience, then everything else fades because your work becomes a gift and a mission. And you're no longer concerned so much with whether you are being the most appropriate vessel for that work that you can be. And in this way, an artist's performance is not entirely unlike an activist's protest, an activist who believes greatly in the message that they're sharing, or even a religious leader who believes that their sermon, their gospel, the prayers that they are leading the congregation in are immensely important because that can be terrifying as well. If you're in front of a huge congregation or you're a community organizer in front of a huge crowd at a protest. Logically, as humans, we know that standing in front of a bunch of people telling them something is one sure way to get chased out of town or or derided or attacked. But when we, whoever we are, for whatever reason, are on that stage in front of a group, if we believe that what we are sharing is essential and life affirming and life changing to our audience, we will find a way to put the message across and we will find a way to do it with confidence.
Fascinating, Daniel. Awesome. Daniel, now you grew up in Rockville, and you went to high school in DC, which is right next to DC. And then when it came time to go to college, you went to Swarthmore, right? And program. What did you learn there, or what was your major?
So at Swarthmore, I tried out about 12 different majors because I was excited by this buffet of possibilities. Just like I was very excited when I first got to the college cafeteria and saw that there were, a dozen different cereals that I could eat on any given day. That was so exciting. In the same way, it was exciting that I could try being a psychology major, a political science major, sociology, history, English. I ended up with English as my major and theater as my minor, but after having tried out a whole bunch of other uh, uh, specialties and concentrations as well, and I started a small theater group while I was in college. That was the first time I had the experience of leading a group of artists, and also my first experience with creating budgets, which turned out to be incredibly useful. As I mentioned earlier, I grew up being sort of hesitant about math. I was much more focused on the creative sphere. And yet, as soon as I realized that using financial projections effectively made it possible for me to help all of the artists in this group to stage their work, and even to have pizza delivered while we were while we were doing our plays and our musicals.
You've been very well recognized for that impact, and the numbers are staggering. Daniel, we'll talk about them. And then you finished at Swarthmore and you joined ICM.
Yes. Before that, I briefly went back to Washington and worked for a theater there called the Studio Theater. It's a fantastic space, and they do great work. I had the opportunity to serve as a dramaturg on a theater performance. So a dramaturg um, is a very interesting practice. It is um, the person who helps to research a play that is being produced, um, and helps the director, the playwright, and the actors to learn about elements of that work that might not be evident. So it's particularly relevant for, let's say, for period pieces, a play that takes place in the 1800s or that takes place in a country that none of the cast may be familiar with. The dramaturg's role is to provide the background materials that may help to inform the performance. And I loved that discipline. That was, for a while, one of the things I thought of myself as, or that I hoped to pursue professionally. So I did have the chance to do that for a little while in Washington, and I got a little New York Times mention for the production that I worked on, and I was super excited. And then right after that, moved up to New York and started working at yes, at a talent agency.
And what kind of work did you do there?
I learned a lot. I worked for two vice presidents, one of what's called special projects, which was um, a department that managed clients who worked in one area who wanted to work in another area. So when Patrick Stewart, who was best known for being on Star Trek: The Next Generation, wanted to star in Macbeth or Othello, our department would handle that. Or when Patti LuPone, who's best known for her Broadway performances, wanted to be in a movie, that's something that our department would handle. So that was very useful. And then the other department was dance, which I knew nothing about. But being part of such a huge entertainment company and such a huge talent agency was a major education for me because I learned, um, uh, you know, on the ground in the midst how huge contracts were negotiated and also what it was like to deal with oversized personalities, with those people who uh, have a lot to say and think highly of themselves. Um, and that's a huge part of working in the arts. It's also a huge part of working in almost any industry where a lot of resources are at stake. Um, a talent agency, and this is also true to some extent of law firms and management firms, but a talent agency is often the intermediary between very accomplished artists and the producers who want to pay them some amount of money to do some amount of very uh, engaging and effective creative work. And so a talent agency is where you have to negotiate between the vagaries and holistic nature of artistic performance and the number crunching and the very exacting nature of contracts and spreadsheets and riders to contracts and all that stuff. So it was a really useful way to become immersed in a sort of muddy discourse between those functions. But I learned a lot about, I also learned how sometimes contracts hide very, very important clauses. And subsequently in my career, whenever I've had the opportunity, I've tried to help artists and creatives decipher very lengthy contracts because it just often is the case that an artist, when they're contracting with, whether it's a university or they're contracting with a big Hollywood studio, the larger entity will generally use a contract to try to secure as many rights as it can. Um, but it's usually in the artist's interest to try to hold back some of those rights and to, at the very least, make sure they understand every detail of the contract. So anyway, working for a talent agency was a very useful grounding in um, the the underpinnings of the legal and financial end of the entertainment world.
And then, you did that for some time and went back to Colombia.
Yes. So I learned a lot, and I started another theater company in the city. A small one, just like I did in college. Um, but so I had the, I guess, advantage of moving to the city more or less at the same time that a bunch of other college students that I knew and other creatives, young people that I met who were just out of school came to the city, which meant there were a bunch of us who had very little money and didn't know much about the city, but what we did have was experience making interesting art with no resources. And doing that with a group is tremendously transformative, especially in a city where everything costs a lot of money. And because of the fact that everything costs a lot of money, professional arts productions tend to be less risk taking than some of the amateur, edgy, low or no budget um, sorts of work. And so I was able, at the same time that I was, first at the talent agency and then back in graduate school, able to produce theater festivals and start doing these, very small scale, but nonetheless very exciting and unpredictable and edgy music and theater productions. And that experience, paid off immensely because when I then ended up working for more institutional organizations, I could bring some of those edgy theater artists and some of that experimental creative energy into these larger, better resourced, more institutional places.
And right after you joined 92nd Streetwise or the McCore Center, right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that was a great experience. And I started while I was in grad school, I started working there and I was at first I basically just walked in and said, "Hey, this would be a great space to do a theater festival. Would you let me stage a theater festival?" And I was told, "Sure, as long as it doesn't cost us anything, you could do it." So as the cliche goes, I did the first one for free, and then I made some money for the organization, and then they started paying me, and I did some more and made some more money. But this is one of those situations where um, the practice of having made interesting, engaging, and profitable art for almost no budget whatsoever came in very handy. The resourcefulness that you need when you are, it would be an overstatement to say a starving artist. I was fortunate enough to never be a starving artist per se. But when you're working, minimum wage jobs in college um, you're in a lot of debt, but you still really want to make art and um, you learn how to take very modest resources and sometimes zero resources whatsoever, but with a strong emphasis on text, character development, and interaction between the artist and the audience to convey a strong impression. I also was very audacious in the requests that I made, and this is another area that I think rising artists need to consider. Um, Sometimes you need to be willing to try punching above your weight, as they say in boxing. My version, when I was starting out at the 92nd Street Y of punching above my weight, was to reach out to Oscar winners, Tony winners, Emmy winners, Pulitzer winners, really well-known artists, and just say, "Hey, we're doing this series. We would love to get you up on stage, and we'd love to have you here doing something, either a reading of work that um, doesn't seem right for anywhere else, but that you want to try to take a chance on here." And so the program that I founded at the Y got a reputation for bringing in big name artists, but big name artists who had some undiscovered work in their desk drawer or on their hard drive, something that just hadn't fit in with any other space. And we were willing to give them the space, the audience, the resources, the opportunity to try out that sort of orphaned work. The Whether it was something that they produced once and then no one wanted to do it again, we would do it, or the thing that they had never found a stage or an outlet for. Um, so yeah, and over time the program grew and developed, um, and yeah. So I helped also to design a downtown venue in Tribeca that the 92nd Street Y opened, and where we also did a lot of theater and talk performances.
In this work, whom were you able to convince to come over?
Wendy Wasserstein, Chaz Palminteri, Peter Falk, Tony Kushner, Robert Altman, Neil LaBute. Um, it got to the point where we were bringing in talent that other departments of the 92nd Street Y wanted. And sometimes we would get in a little bit of hot water for that because we were giving the artists the opportunity to do work that was more counter to the expectations audiences would have. And that's actually something I continued to do at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. One of the ways that we got some bigger name artists there as well was to offer them a chance to try out something that they hadn't done before, or try out work that defied audience expectations that was in a different category than what they were known for.
Yeah, and that happened in 2008, 2009 or so.
Yes, yeah. I started going to the cafe um, as an audience member and enjoyed the poetry slams and shows that I saw. I got involved with a theater production that was taking place at the cafe, and then I found out they were looking for an executive director, and I was both excited and terrified by the opportunity. Because the cafe is a legendary organization and was certainly before I arrived on the scene and an organization that had launched many careers and also a place in which, to go back to an earlier point, the the boundary between performer and audience is much more diaphanous and much less defined than it is in many spaces. And I loved that from the moment I first stepped in that room. But it can also be a terrifying fact if you're trying to perform or produce work, because in that space, you hear from everyone. You hear from spectators, from volunteers, from artists. It is an arena that encourages constant dialogue. And that is the source of some of the most um, powerful creative work that has come out of that space. But it also means that for a newcomer, it can be an overwhelming amount of discussion and discourse and energy being shared back and forth. A larger institutional venue like the 92nd Street Y, yes, there is discussion and discourse, but art is presented in a much more traditional, much more formal way. Usually, the artists will be on a proscenium stage, the audience will be seated in front of them, and the audience will respond politely, enthusiastically when appropriate. But at the end of a performance or during a Q&A session, etc. At the cafe, part of what is so exciting, part of what keeps audiences coming back and artists coming back, is that the energy doesn't disappear. From the moment you walk into the venue, spectators and artists are mixing, improvising, whether the show is started or not. People are constantly in discourse and constantly rehearsing. The line outside the cafe, that on Friday nights in particular would go down the block, and sometimes around the block. There are people who met in that line and got married. There are people who met in that line and started a musical or a theater collaboration that led to their professional careers. There are people whose political careers or community organizing careers started just waiting in line for a performance. And that's before you even get into the venue. Once you get into the venue, so many of the people in the audience are themselves artists, because artists come there not just to perform, but to be inspired by other artists. And every time that there was a spoken word event, there would always be some number of people seated at the bar with a pad, and some of them would be sketching, some of them would be writing down ideas, some of them would be brainstorming, because there's something about hearing exciting, loud, vibrant, energetic, unpredictable vocal performances that just spurs the creative imagination, especially for people who probably are spending much of their day in a 9 to 5 job where creativity may not be a watchword, where it may not be as valued a tenet of the work. So people would come to the cafe to unwind, to relax, to be inspired, to get energized. And I loved it from the moment that I stepped in, but I also saw people getting up on that stage sometimes and being just terrified, not starstruck, but struck by how much audience energy they could absorb and how much they were responsible. Because even if someone gets up on the stage at a spoken word venue, particularly the cafe, but really any spoken word venue, for 3 minutes, you have the intense attention of a partly sober, very focused, and very honest and direct audience focused on you. More so than in lots of venues. You go to Broadway theater, off-Broadway theater, an opera house, even most concert venues. People will respond enthusiastically, but you're not going to get the immediate feedback and the directness of feedback that you get at a spoken word venue like the cafe. If people love your work, they're not going to wait till the end of it to tell you about it. They're going to be snapping, clapping, cheering. They will audibly talk back to you in the most encouraging way possible. If they don't like your work, you are also going to find out. Generally speaking, and I don't mean to make it sound terrifying, it's not actually terrifying. Most of the time, audiences, even if they don't like the work, they're not going to boo, they're not going to throw stuff at the stage. But you can tell very quickly if your work is going over well or not so well. And that's partly just about whether people are focused on you or not, partly about whether but in any case, it's very much like an athletic competition in the sense that you are immediately gathering feedback from your environment, from all angles of your environment. Audiences are sitting in basically a semicircle around the stage. So as a performer, you have to learn to deliver your work to multiple different viewpoints and multiple different directions. But it also is one of those arenas that helps people learn how to be the most possible, the most resilient, most adaptable, and most confident versions of their onstage self possible. And I've seen people go from the stage at the cafe to careers as award winners, as politicians, as business leaders, as successful writers.
Daniel, amongst all the awesome things you've done at the Nuyorican, one of your legacies has been the success you had with fundraising there. You raised more than $10 million. How did you do that, and what made you successful?
Thank you for that. Actually, the total that I raised was in the for the capital renovation of the cafe was over 20 million, believe it or not. But it happened over years. Fundraising is storytelling, and it took me forever to realize that. But fundraising for a nonprofit organization, for a politician, or for a startup, it is still storytelling, and maybe it is in its own way the purest kind of storytelling because the storyteller, the fundraiser, the CEO or executive director has to believe their story, has to know their audience well enough to find the elements of the narrative that will connect with the funder's priorities, past giving history, and future interests and intentions. And the the storyteller has to be able to back up that narrative with financials, if it's a capital project with blueprints and plans, if it's a program that serves the community with testimonials and photo and audio and video evidence that the programs are effective and persuasive. And that storyteller needs to be able to maintain a consistent narrative and through line while shaping and morphing the story to fit the needs and interests of multiple audiences and stakeholders. Because no two funders want or care about exactly the same thing. But the mission of the organization or the story and the narrative and the goal behind the project for which you are raising funds, that shouldn't change. It's simply the dimension of that larger venture that you are trying to convey in a way that resonates with your audiences, with the funders' prerogatives and their past work. So, a big part of how I've always prepared for fundraising is learning as much as I possibly can about the individual or the corporate or political entity I'm trying to raise money from, and then building a relationship because a successful philanthropic connection almost never happens overnight and should never be expended in one transaction. It is about creating a friendship, a connection, and welcoming the funder into the community of the organization. And each organization has a different way to do that. But making sure that the funder understands the work and that the organization is a good fit. Because the other thing that's unfortunately true is that sometimes possible sources of funding may not be an appropriate alignment for a particular organization or project. But knowing your potential funder well enough and then finding resonance between your narrative, your work, and what you believe are the central goal, mission, and tenets of your organization and the funder's priorities. Um, that's the essential journey.
Daniel, thank you for sharing. Daniel, when we first started, I talked about you wearing multiple hats of a writer, director, teacher, fundraiser, creator. Through this very fascinating conversation with you, I think you're a scholar at heart.
That is kind of you to say.
You've been recognized recently with the 2022 Fulbright Specialist Fellowship. Tell us a little bit more about that and what has enabled you to do with that fellowship.
Oh yes, thank you for bringing that up. So yes, I had the honor of being awarded a Fulbright Specialist Fellowship for work with a university in Portugal, and this built on my experience of using social media and digital communications platforms to help individual artists and creative and nonprofit organizations tell their stories compellingly to online audiences. Um, and I started doing that work in the early 2000s when social media still wasn't taken seriously by nonprofit organizations or universities or whatever. It was at that time, it was seen not entirely unlike AI has come to be seen these days as both a potent possibility, but still as sort of a gadget or a fun, eccentric pastime. But bit by bit, I found ways to help organizations, both the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, House of Speakeasy, but lots of clients and several parts of the U.S. State Department that I've worked for at times. All of them use social media effectively to convey the value of artistic work um, to audiences around the country and across the globe. So I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to travel to Portugal, specifically Leiria in Portugal, and to work with university professors, department heads, students, community members, and arts leaders on finding innovative ways to leverage digital communication strategies and social media and other online marketing tools to tell stories, to raise awareness for artistic practices, and to raise funds for fledgling arts projects. And yeah, it was incredibly rewarding. I was thrilled to be able to interact with the academic and artistic community in Leiria and to become more acquainted with Portugal as a whole. And, I also just find that the transformative potential of some of these tools so often gets lost, understandably so, because there's a lot of negative impact, of course, that unfettered use of social media can have. And because in many cases, the platforms themselves and the companies that launch and own and maintain them are not so focused on on helping nonprofit organizations and artists and arts entities figure out benevolent strategies. The possibilities are there, but for someone who is not very experienced in using these platforms to promote their work, um, it can be helpful to have advisors and teachers. So I very much enjoy teaching that work, and particularly to creatives and educators.
And Daniel, if you were to quickly summarize the core principles that nonprofits and not organizations should be using, I know that's a lot to ask because there is no quick
Sure.
summary. But if you were to do that, what are the core principles and how should they be using it?
Absolutely. One is to learn how the audiences you want to reach are currently perceiving your organization. Another is to learn about the landscape, cautionary tales as well as best practices. See how the organizations or the artists that you want to emulate are creating and sustaining online momentum. Um, Come up with a realistic and sustainable, if also aggressive goal for how you can build your presence and begin to convey your message on a recurring timeline. And I say reasonable and sustainable because anyone can, individuals, organizations, businesses can become very excited early in the process of growing their online presence and very ambitious. The challenge is that after 3 weeks or 3 months or a year, staff and consultants who might not previously have expected to spend that much time generating or reposting or repositioning creative content can be exhausted by the process. And your audiences, your stakeholders, your fans can also become exhausted. So, sustainability, regularity, um, and also finding a balance between content that is directly relevant to your work and content that is more resonant with your brand and supportive of colleague organizations or colleague artists, even if it does not directly advance your work. So for a theater, that might be spending, let's say 65% of your online energy, activity, and resources on work that directly promotes your shows and your artists and your board members and et cetera. But then the remaining 30 to 40%, spending that championing other artists, drawing people's attention to news stories, focusing on what alumni of your organization might be doing. An artist who was there 3 years ago, who's gone on to great pursuits since. Finding ways that your feed can champion the entire ecosystem you are part of, because that positivity invariably rebounds on the organization. And it also means that people, viewers, audiences will start to see your online identity and your feed as being a source not just of promotional content over and over about your work, which can cause people over time to tune it out, but also a valuable source of information about the industry, the lane that you're in, and those colleagues who you want to be identified with. And that's a very important thing as well for organizations as well as individuals. Come up with lists of who you see yourself as being in the company of, or who you want to be seen in the company of. If you're a small organization, there are 5 medium-sized organizations that you respect and admire. Start looking at how they position their content and what sort of content they share. And, but also, when you can, start tagging them, posting about what you admire about those organizations. Look at their strategy, find ways to emulate it. And also, cross pollination with completely different art forms is very useful. Some of the best inspiration can come from learning about artistic practices that are outside the realm of your organization and finding resonance between the work that you do and other practices. Similarly, um, within an organization, sometimes the most interesting inspiration for online content can come from outside of the marketing department, from people who work, from audience members, from artists, from interns, from board members. Incredibly interesting and useful content can come from people whose perspective on the organization might fall outside of a traditional definition of marketing.
So, Daniel, now that you've been back from Portugal, you've started working at the Vineyard Theatre. Please tell us a little bit more about your role over there and what kind of work you do.
Sure. Well, I've been a fan of the Vineyard for many years. I used to live a block away from it, and every day I would walk by and I would see, just amazing theatrical energy going on there, and some of the shows that started there went on to Broadway and touring and et cetera. So I was very excited to get involved. The work that I do there is at the intersection of marketing, fundraising, press, um, so kind of financial and publicity combined. And I really enjoy that juncture because it is about a multiplicity of ways to tell the story of an organization that I'm inspired by, and an organization also that um, has a great track record and yet I think can do even more. Um, and I'm excited as well because this is such a critical juncture in the evolution of um, performing arts within the US and globally, but particularly, I think, theater organizations in the age of, uh, you know, AI becoming ascendant, and at a time when um, the authenticity of online content is more in question than it ever was before. There's something about the shared communal experience in a live theater venue that is immensely valuable. And the Vineyard in particular, I love because it embraces sometimes very challenging and dystopian artists' visions at the same time that the Vineyard always produces an entertaining and engaging show, which I think is why audiences and critics have sought out the theater for years. But I also like that, not entirely unlike the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, it's still a very intimate venue and one in which the artists and the audience can feel very connected, very closely connected to each other. So I like that it's a risk-taking venue, it's an intimate venue, but it's also one with a global reputation and where work that is developed under the Vineyard's auspices goes all over the place. So I am very thrilled to be in the position of being able to help tell the stories of the artists, the staff, the team members who bring these productions into being, and also at the forefront of efforts to gather and raise more resources to expand the work that the Vineyard is doing. And just like the Nuyorican, which is currently undergoing that massive renovation that I worked with our funders and partners to raise all that money for over the years, the Vineyard is also going to be embarking on a big renovation to make sure that its venue and its capacity remains sustainable for the next several decades. So this is a critical juncture at the Vineyard for that reason as well. Um, and in general, I see any number of ways that live performance in a physical venue is going to become more and more prized and relevant every year. I've always been invested in live cultural experiences and the community um, impact of live original work, but I'm even more so now than ever before because it is just so much harder for communities to form around and evaluate the authenticity of content online that, and especially after a pandemic that isolated people for so long, the the shared experience of witnessing um, creative, edgy, inventive, engaging, but also unpredictable work in a live context uh, is immensely valuable for education, for community cohesion, for inspiration. So I'm thrilled to be part of the process of and overseeing the fundraising and communications for an organization that takes big creative risks, but does so in a way that embraces community cohesion and education.
Daniel, couldn't this be the golden age of the kind of work you do? Because if you think about it, you are immune from AI in many ways. Like video and recorded work, is under attack already. The authenticity parts of it, right? Of course, original
Yes.
is highly valued, right? And on top of that, I remember you saying that there is no escape at your venues. There's no dazzling lights that will blind you,
Right.
right? That you can feel the audience. So that transfer of energy goes both ways, right? Doesn't
Oh,
that make
yes.
you immune? And are you not entering the golden age of live close up? And it might produce the masters that do close up hand magic, right?
Yes. Well, as they say, from your mouth to God's ears. Um, I think it is absolutely true that the performing arts are entering an era, and I think have been since the pandemic, but even more so now and in the years immediately following, are on an upward trajectory, and audience and community hunger for those experiences is unprecedented. Um, at the same time, the financial challenges, um, escalation of living costs, um, inflation and its impact on production expenses, um, labor costs, property taxes, all of those expenses come to bear on the performing arts every bit as much as they do on other trades and professions. Fortunately, the Vineyard, where I am now, and the Nuyorican, where I'm still on the board, and a couple of other organizations that I'm connected to as a either advisor or board member, et cetera. I There are a number of organizations that are insulated to some degree. Um, an organization that owns its own home or that has a favorable lease is much more likely to survive market pressures. And an organization that has good relationships with funders and also a loyal audience base is much more likely to be able. But even so, this is one of those eras in which the problem-solving elements of arts leadership are still incredibly important, despite all of the demand for this work, and despite the fact that there are that other forms of entertainment are becoming more sort of divorced from the reality and the spontaneity and the unpredictability of live performance. It's still true that live performance venues need thoughtful, practical leadership. And they also need the support of foundations and government funders and individuals who are inspired by that work. And to really take our conversation almost back to the beginning, early on, we were talking about how, despite the transformative nature of cultural practices and art forms in general, that many leaders, many funders, many humans across the world still see artistic practice as an indulgence, as a hobby, and neglect to provide the sort of support or treat it with the seriousness that cultural practices deserve. And the fact is that the storytelling skills, the community building skills that are nurtured in the artistic arena apply to every realm of life. And the narratives that we build in intimate venues like the Vineyard, like the Nuyorican, like the 92nd Street Y, can end wars, can bring together social movements, can bring about tremendous societal change. These are immensely important, valuable, essential societal goods that are produced in these venues. And so part of my job and my mission is to continue conveying the value and the worth of essential artistic practices to the funders, the individual donors, the government officials, and the public at large to make sure that we can continue doing this work for decades to come.
Daniel, you're clearly excited by your mission.
Well,
Recurring themes in what you said, and I can feel that energy, and I'm very certain our audience can as well feel that energy. Daniel, in this changing world, do you see AI enhance the art? Are there angles, the very positive angles there? And if so, what might be those angles of AI enhancing the art?
yeah, it's a great and important question. Uh, AI, not unlike social media, has since the earliest moment that it became available in a widespread, scalable way to a global user base, has been both lionized and demonized. Um, and in that sense, it's not that different from the printing press. In the details of how these technologies will impact thought leadership, creative communication, and our ability to um, nurture artistic activities and also to make artistic products available to the public. These are tools that can be as holy or devilish, as positive or negative as the practitioners who use them. There is certainly unprecedented capacity and capability for artificial intelligence to fuel the work of artists who may not even currently think of themselves as artists. I mean, that's the sign of a transformative technological revolution, that it empowers practitioners who previously had not considered a field of creativity accessible to them. Social media certainly did that. The printing press certainly did that. AI is certainly doing that. At the same time, it will and already has begun the process of marginalizing some long-term practitioners of creative disciplines. I'm thinking primarily of some of the craftspeople whose work fuels film, video, and TV productions. Those jobs haven't been eliminated, but they already are dropping off somewhat because it is just meteorically more cost effective to do some of that work with AI engines. And in the video game world, that's true as well. There's some rendering that is now much more straightforward and affordable to do with an AI engine than used to be the case, and fewer humans are involved. But the transformation to the creative landscape that these technologies bring, first of all, it's inescapable. So there's no use in us wringing our hands too much and regretting that things won't be the way that they were, because that's simply I would add to this list also, when sound became part of motion pictures, there were those artists, performers, and others who suddenly found their livelihoods upended. But there are art forms that have not yet come to be that AI will power. There are communities and even generations of artists who don't think of themselves or wouldn't otherwise have thought of themselves as being artistically capable, who will be able to do so because of AI. And its ability to adapt content to the user is also unprecedented. Social media has given us a tiny taste of that. But the idea that each of us will be able to watch a movie or a TV show or a video and have that content adapt to us as we're watching it, whether that adaptation means that it will automatically translate work into the language that we speak and understand, or it means that It will enhance elements of the narrative or the background that resonate with our interests, or that there will be regionally specific elements of that content. I mean, that is an amazing, um, very potent, and just one of many possible features of this new technology. The fact that art can itself learn from the audience and adapt to the audience is a feedback loop without precedent, and one that will absolutely transform our artistic landscape.
Thank you, Daniel. That's a powerful perspective. The year is 1400. The printing press has come into being, and we're printing Bibles and witch hunting books.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. So there's early printed matter that is cruel and backwards and ignorant, just as there is early printed matter that is forward thinking and enlightened.
And that's the age of AI today.
Oh, absolutely. Very much so. There is a very insular, tribal, destructive, small-minded thinking being furthered and accentuated by AI, and there is magnanimous, boundary-pushing, beautiful, transformative work that is coming into being. And in many cases, it's happening on the exact same app at the same time, sometimes even with variations of the same video, which is one of those areas that I find the most brilliant and beautiful. But I know that a lot of professional producers of cinematic and television entertainment find the most threatening. The fact that on some of these platforms, you can remix a video in five different directions. You can make it transcendent, you can make it holy, you can make it beautiful, you can make it family friendly with a few prompts, but you can also take it in the other direction and make it antagonistic, make it nationalistic, make it jingoistic. Um, we don't yet know what that outcome is going to be, and there will be terrifying elements of it. There will be cases in which content is remixed to horrific effect. There will also be cases in which content is remixed and personalized to transformative, magnificent, society reshaping effect.
Daniel, thank you for sharing your take on it. This has been a fascinating conversation. We have talked of so many different things and your journey. Truly enjoyed speaking with you. Is there anything else you would like to share with our audience?
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and I hope that some of this is of use and interest to your audience. I would just say that at a time of great technological, political, and economic change, fear, excitement, and wonder are the natural cornucopia of emotions. And it is important that we, as creatives, as those who appreciate creative work, and as those who are pursuing entrepreneurial and other transformative practices, it's essential to be aware of and open to all of those emotions simultaneously, because sometimes the best ideas come to us out of a spark of wonder, and sometimes the best and most useful ideas and innovations come to us as a reaction to fear or concern. And these are equally valid and important parts of the creative and inspirational process. So I think an effective work of art and an effective creative practice is one that embraces and emphasizes the hopeful, but also the fearful.
Today, we were joined by Daniel Gallant, a scholar, cultural leader, strategist, storyteller, whose career has had a lasting impact on the art scene in our country. Daniel, thank you so much for being on the Inference Show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor.